The antique wooden music box sat on Dorothy Williams' coffee table like a forgotten relic, its mother-of-pearl inlay catching the afternoon light streaming through her living room window. The melody of Fur Elise wheezed out in broken notes when she lifted the lid, the mechanism worn from decades of use. To Dorothy, it was a treasure, a connection to her beloved great-aunt Evelyn who had raised her after her parents died. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To her family, gathering around her modest ranch home that crisp November afternoon, it was just another piece of junk, cluttering up their mother's increasingly crowded house. "Mom, seriously, when are you going to get rid of that thing?" Susan Williams Parker sighed, gesturing dismissively at the jewelry box while scrolling through her phone. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked against the screen as she checked her real estate listings. It doesn't even play music properly anymore. It's just taking up space. Dorothy's weathered hands paused over the box's ornate surface, her fingers tracing the delicate patterns that had captivated her as a child. She had called this family meeting to discuss something important, something that had been weighing on her heart for months. At 72, living alone in the house she and Frank had shared for 35 years, she was beginning to feel the walls closing in. But instead of listening, her children seemed more interested in cataloging everything they considered worthless. "That old music box probably wouldn't sell for $20 at a garage sale," Michael chimed in from the recliner, not bothering to look up from the football game playing on his tablet. Her son had always been gentler than Susan, but lately he seemed just as eager to dismiss everything she held dear. "You've got so much stuff in here, Mom." Jessica's right. It's becoming a real problem. Jessica, her 22-year-old granddaughter, was perched on the edge of the sofa, her attention split between taking selfies and half listening to the conversation. "Like, no offense, Grandma, but that thing is super outdated. Nobody wants old stuff anymore. Everything's about minimalism and clean aesthetics now. It's just not your brand." She giggled at her own use of marketing terminology, clearly proud of her college education in action. Tyler, Jessica's 19-year-old cousin, remained silent in the corner chair, earbuds dangling around his neck. He offered Dorothy a sympathetic glance when their eyes met, but said nothing. He rarely spoke during these family gatherings, content to let the others do the talking while he waited for an acceptable time to leave. Dorothy felt her chest tighten as she watched her family dismiss not just the music box but everything it represented. They saw clutter where she saw memories, junk where she saw history. The jewelry box had belonged to Aunt Evelyn, the woman who had taught her to find beauty in overlooked things, to see value where others saw none. When Evelyn passed away 15 years ago, she had specifically left the music box to Dorothy, along with a note that simply read, "For someone who understands that the most precious things are often hidden in plain sight." "It's not about the money," Dorothy said quietly, her voice barely audible over the drone of Michael's tablet. "Aunt Evelyn gave this to me. It has sentimental value." Susan finally looked up from her phone, her expression softening slightly but still maintaining that patient tone she used with difficult clients. "Mom, I get that, I really do. But you can't keep everything just because it reminds you of someone. This house is becoming impossible to navigate. When's the last time you used the dining room table? It's covered with newspapers and magazines from 2019. The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. Since Frank's death 8 years ago, Dorothy had found comfort in collecting things. Estate sale finds, antique shop discoveries, items that others had discarded. Each piece told a story, connected her to people and times that felt increasingly distant from the modern world her family inhabited. But somewhere along the way, her collecting had become a source of embarrassment for them, a sign that she was losing her grip on reality. "I've been thinking," Dorothy began, attempting to steer the conversation toward the real reason she had asked them to come over. "About downsizing. Maybe moving to one of those senior communities. Riverside Apartments has some nice units, and they allow you to bring your own furniture." She gestured toward the music box. "I was hoping you might help me decide what to keep and what to—" "Finally!" Susan exclaimed, her realtor instincts immediately kicking into high gear. Mom, that's such a smart decision. The housing market is really strong right now. I could probably get you top dollar for this place. And honestly, a clean, modern apartment would be so much better for you. No more maintenance, no more yard work, and definitely no more room for all this. She waved her hand vaguely around the living room. Michael muted his tablet and leaned forward, suddenly interested in the conversation. That's great, Mom. I think that's exactly what Dad would have wanted for you. He always worried about you being alone in this big house. Dorothy nodded, though she wondered if Frank would have understood her need to hold on to the things that connected her to their shared past. He had been practical, like their children, but he had also understood her emotional attachment to family heirlooms and meaningful objects. The music box had sat on their mantelpiece for years, and Frank had never once suggested it was taking up space or needed to be discarded. So we're talking about getting rid of most of this stuff, right? Jessica asked, gesturing around the room with renewed enthusiasm. Like, a total fresh start? That's actually really cool, Grandma. Very Marie Kondo. The conversation continued around Dorothy as if she had become invisible, her family members discussing her belongings and her future living arrangements with the detached efficiency of estate planners. Susan was already calculating square footage and market comparisons on her phone. Michael was nodding along, occasionally offering practical suggestions about moving companies and storage units. Jessica had moved on to researching minimalist apartment decor on Instagram, occasionally showing Tyler pictures of sparse, modern living spaces that looked nothing like the warm, cluttered home Dorothy had spent decades creating. Nobody asked what Dorothy wanted to keep. Nobody inquired about the stories behind her collections or the memories attached to specific pieces. The music box, still sitting open on the coffee table, continued to wheeze out its broken melody, but no one seemed to notice the sound anymore. It had become background noise, as easily ignored as Dorothy's own voice when she tried to explain why certain items mattered to her. Dorothy had spent 40 years as an elementary school teacher, and she recognized the dynamic unfolding in her living room. It was the same pattern she had observed countless times in her classroom when older students dismissed the contributions of younger ones, or when popular children talked over their quieter classmates. The difference was that now she was the one being overlooked, her opinions and preferences treated as obstacles to overcome rather than factors to consider. You know what would be really helpful? Susan said, finally putting down her phone and addressing Dorothy directly. If you could start going through things now, before we list the house, just sort everything into 3 piles. Keep, donate, and trash. I bet you'll find that most of this stuff falls into the last 2 categories. Michael nodded enthusiastically. That's a great idea. And Mom, be honest with yourself about what you actually need. You're moving to a much smaller space. You won't have room for all these books and knickknacks and... His gaze fell on the music box. Stuff like that. Dorothy felt something shift inside her as she watched her son dismiss the music box with the same casual indifference he might show toward a piece of junk mail. This wasn't the first time her family had made comments about her possessions, but something about this moment felt different. Perhaps it was the way they had all ganged up on her, or the casual assumption that her opinions didn't matter in decisions about her own life. Perhaps it was the realization that they saw her not as a person with her own preferences and memories, but as a problem to be solved. I suppose you're right, Dorothy said quietly, closing the lid of the music box. The broken melody stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of Susan's fingers tapping against her phone screen and the distant murmur of Michael's football game. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with her family making lists and plans and timelines that Dorothy barely followed. They discussed real estate agents and moving companies and storage facilities with the enthusiasm of people planning a vacation. Dorothy found herself nodding along, offering minimal responses when directly asked questions, but internally retreating to a place where their voices became white noise. When they finally left, each offering perfunctory hugs and promises to help with the sorting process, Dorothy remained seated on her sofa staring at the music box. The house felt impossibly quiet after the chaos of voices and opinions and plans. She reached over and opened the lid again, listening to the faltering notes of Fur-Elise, and remembering the first time Aunt Evelyn had played it for her. Dorothy had been 7 years old, newly orphaned and scared, when she had come to live with her great-aunt in the rambling Victorian house on the outskirts of town. Evelyn had been a mystery to most people, an unmarried woman who collected antiques and told stories about the objects in her home as if they were old friends. Other relatives had whispered that Evelyn was eccentric, maybe even a little touched in the head, but to Dorothy, she had been magical. The music box had been Evelyn's most prized possession, inherited from her own grandmother, who had brought it from Germany in the 1890s. Evelyn had told Dorothy stories about the craftsmanship, about the hidden compartments and secret mechanisms that made it more than just a simple music box. She had promised that someday, when Dorothy was older, she would teach her all of the box's secrets. But Evelyn had died suddenly when Dorothy was in college, and by the time Dorothy had returned home for the funeral, most of Evelyn's possessions had already been sold or donated by well-meaning relatives who saw only clutter where Evelyn had seen beauty. The music box had been saved only because it had been specifically mentioned in Evelyn's will, along with a note about hidden treasures and patient discovery. Dorothy had treasured the music box throughout her marriage to Frank, through the years of raising Susan and Michael, through decades of teaching other people's children while her own grew up and moved away. It had sat on her mantelpiece like a guardian of memories, a reminder of the woman who had taught her that value couldn't always be measured in dollars and cents. Now, sitting alone in her living room while her family's dismissive words echoed in her memory, Dorothy wondered if she had been foolish to hold on to such things. Perhaps Susan and Michael were right. Perhaps she was just a sentimental old woman clinging to objects that had outlived their usefulness. Perhaps the music box was just a broken toy, taking up space in a world that valued efficiency over sentiment. She closed the lid and carried the music box to the kitchen, where she placed it next to the stack of newspapers Susan had criticized. Tomorrow, she would start the sorting process her family had demanded. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of deciding which pieces of her life were worth keeping, and which were destined for donation bins and trash bags. But tonight, she would allow herself to grieve for the parts of her story that her family would never understand, and for the realization that the people she loved most in the world saw her not as a person with her own history and preferences, but as an obstacle to their plans for her future. The music box sat silent on the counter, its secrets locked away, waiting for someone who understood that the most valuable things are often the ones that others dismiss as worthless. Dorothy woke the next morning with a heaviness in her chest that had nothing to do with the gray November sky pressing against her bedroom windows. She had barely slept, her mind churning through the previous day's conversation and the casual way her family had discussed dismantling her life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Life. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, its automatic timer a small comfort in the growing uncertainty of her daily routine. She patted through the house in her slippers, noting each item that Susan and Michael would undoubtedly label as unnecessary clutter. The ceramic owl collection on the hallway shelf, gifts from former students who remembered her love of wise creatures. The stack of quilting magazines by her reading chair, filled with patterns she had been meaning to try. The photograph albums crowding the bookshelf, documenting decades of family gatherings and school events and quiet moments with Frank. In the kitchen, the music box sat where she had left it the night before, its wooden surface dull in the morning light. Dorothy poured her coffee and sat down across from it, studying the intricate inlay work that had fascinated her as a child. Aunt Evelyn had always insisted that the box was special, that it held secrets beyond its simple function as a jewelry container and music player. But in all the years Dorothy had owned it, she had never discovered anything more than the basic compartments visible when the lid was opened. Perhaps her family was right. Perhaps she was holding on to meaningless objects while missing the practical realities of her situation. At 72, living alone in a 3-bedroom house with a basement full of estate sale finds and an attic stuffed with Christmas decorations, she was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of her possessions. When Frank was alive, he had helped her organize and maintain their collections. Without him, everything felt chaotic and purposeless. The phone rang, interrupting her brooding. Susan's name appeared on the caller ID, and Dorothy briefly considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, she answered on the 4th ring, steeling herself for another conversation about downsizing and decluttering. Morning, Mom. Susan's voice was bright with professional efficiency. I hope you don't mind, but I drove by the house this morning on my way to show a property. I was thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I really think we should get started on this sorting process as soon as possible. The market is so good right now, and I'd hate for you to miss out on top dollar because we waited too long. Dorothy sipped her coffee, watching steam rise from the mug. I haven't even had breakfast yet, Susan. I know. I'm not saying we need to start today, but maybe this weekend? I could bring some boxes, and we could tackle one room at a time. Start with the obvious stuff, things you definitely don't need anymore. The obvious stuff. Dorothy wondered what that category included in Susan's mind. Probably everything that didn't fit into a modern apartment aesthetic. Probably most of the items that connected Dorothy to her past, to the people she had loved, to the version of herself that existed before everyone decided she needed to be managed. Jessica offered to help too, Susan continued. She's really good at organizing, and she has such a good eye for what's current and what's outdated. She could help you figure out what might actually have some resale value. Dorothy set down her coffee mug with more force than necessary, the ceramic clicking against the wooden table. I don't need Jessica to tell me what's valuable in my own home. There was a pause on Susan's end, the kind of silence that suggested Dorothy had stepped outside the boundaries of acceptable response. Mom, she's just trying to help. We all are. This is a big transition, and we want to make it as easy as possible for you. Easy for whom? Dorothy wondered. Easy for Susan, who wanted a quick sale and a simplified estate to manage. Easy for Michael, who clearly felt burdened by his mother's possessions and emotional attachments. Easy for Jessica and Tyler, who would inherit a tidy sum instead of a house full of items they considered worthless. I'll think about it, Dorothy said, which was her standard response when she wanted to end a conversation without committing to anything. Okay, but don't think too long. I really want to get this process started. Oh, and Mom? Maybe start with some of the smaller items, like that music box and the ceramic collections. Things that are taking up space but aren't really functional anymore. After Susan hung up, Dorothy sat in the quiet kitchen, feeling the walls of her life closing in around her. She had raised 2 children in this house, teaching them to value history and craftsmanship and the stories that objects could tell. She had spent decades as an educator, showing young minds how to look beyond surface appearances to find deeper meaning and connection. Now her own children were treating her like a child who needed guidance and making basic decisions about her own possessions. The music box seemed to beckon from across the table, its mother-of-pearl inlay catching a shaft of weak sunlight streaming through the window. Dorothy reached over and opened it, listening to the familiar wheeze of Fur Elise playing in broken measures. The melody was indeed damaged, but there was something hauntingly beautiful about its imperfection, like an old voice still trying to sing despite the ravages of time. As the song played, Dorothy found herself really examining the box for the first time in years. Aunt Evelyn had always hinted that it was more than it appeared, but Dorothy had assumed she was being poetic, the way elderly people often romanticize their possessions. Now, with nothing but time and a growing sense of desperation, she looked more closely at the construction. The interior was lined with faded velvet, worn smooth in places where jewelry had been placed and removed countless times. The main compartment was larger than she had remembered, deep enough to hold substantial pieces. But as she traced her fingers along the edges, she noticed something odd about the proportions. The box appeared deeper on the outside than it was on the inside, as if there was hidden space beneath the velvet lining. Dorothy had never been particularly handy, but 40 years of teaching elementary school had given her patience and observational skills. She pressed gently around the edges of the interior, feeling for anything that might give way or shift. At first, nothing happened. Then, near the back left corner, she felt a slight depression in what she had assumed was solid wood. When she pressed more firmly, something clicked. A thin panel in the bottom of the box shifted slightly, revealing a narrow gap that hadn't been visible before. Dorothy's heart rate quickened as she carefully worked her fingernail into the gap, gently prying until the false bottom lifted to reveal a hidden compartment beneath. The space was small but substantial, lined with what appeared to be oiled silk that had preserved its contents remarkably well. Inside, Dorothy found a collection of items that took her breath away. There were several pieces of jewelry, but not the costume pieces she had expected. These were clearly antique, crafted with the kind of attention to detail that suggested significant value. A brooch, set with what appeared to be genuine emeralds. A pair of earrings with stones that caught the light like tiny stars. A delicate chain bracelet that felt substantial in her palm. But it was the papers beneath the jewelry that made Dorothy's hands tremble. There were several documents, carefully folded and preserved in what looked like oiled cloth. The first was a letter, written in Aunt Evelyn's familiar handwriting but dated just months before her death. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clearly legible. "My dearest Dorothy," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have discovered what I always hoped you would find. The jewelry in this box belonged to our great-grandmother, who brought these pieces from the old country when she immigrated. She was a clever woman who understood that valuable things must sometimes be hidden from those who would not appreciate their worth." Dorothy read on, her coffee growing cold as Aunt Evelyn's words revealed family history she had never known. Their great-grandmother had been more than the simple immigrant woman family stories had portrayed. She had been the daughter of a jewelry maker, and the pieces in the box represented not just monetary value, but artistic heritage, passed down through generations of women who understood the importance of preserving beautiful things. "The emerald brooch alone," Evelyn's letter continued, "was appraised in 1987 at $8,000. I can only imagine what it might be worth today. But more important than its monetary value is what it represents. The wisdom of women who knew that independence sometimes requires hidden resources." The second document was even more surprising. It was an official appraisal from 1987, signed by a certified gemologist in Columbus. The brooch was indeed genuine, set with Colombian emeralds and surrounded by diamonds. The earrings were Victorian-era pieces, with rare Padparaja sapphires. The bracelet was crafted by a renowned European artisan, whose work was highly sought after by collectors. But the final document was what made Dorothy sit back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications of her discovery. It was an insurance policy, taken out by Aunt Evelyn in 1988 and paid faithfully until her death. The policy covered the jewelry collection for its full appraised value, which had been substantial even in the 1980s. More importantly, the policy had been transferred to Dorothy upon Evelyn's death, though the paperwork had apparently been lost in the chaos of settling the estate. Dorothy spread the documents across her kitchen table, trying to process what she had found. The music box that her family dismissed as worthless junk contained a collection of antique jewelry that could potentially be worth tens of thousands of dollars. More than that, it contained a piece of family history that completely reframed her understanding of her heritage. Her great-grandmother hadn't been just a poor immigrant struggling to survive in a new country. She had been a woman of means and culture, someone who understood the value of beautiful things and the importance of preserving them for future generations. Aunt Evelyn had been the keeper of this legacy, and she had entrusted it to Dorothy because she believed Dorothy would understand its significance. The irony was almost overwhelming. For months, her family had been pressuring her to get rid of her possessions, dismissing her collections as the hoarding behavior of an elderly woman who couldn't let go of the past. They had specifically targeted the music box as an example of worthless clutter that needed to be discarded. Meanwhile, they were unknowingly asking her to throw away a treasure that represented both significant monetary value and irreplaceable family heritage. Dorothy carefully returned the jewelry and documents to their hidden compartment, closing the false bottom and ensuring that the music box appeared exactly as it had before her discovery. She sat back in her chair, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. Should she tell her family what she had found? Should she have the collection appraised to determine its current value? Should she continue to let them believe the box was worthless, while she figured out what to do with this unexpected windfall? The phone rang again, this time displaying Michael's number. Dorothy stared at it for several rings before deciding to answer. "Hey, Mom." Michael's voice was casual, friendly. "Susan told me you guys talked about getting started on the sorting this weekend. I was thinking I could come over Saturday morning and help you go through some of the bigger items. Maybe start with the furniture and work our way down to the smaller stuff." Dorothy looked at the music box, sitting innocently on her table while concealing secrets that could change everything. "I'm not sure I'm ready to start this weekend," Mom, I know it's overwhelming, but the sooner we get started, the sooner you can start your new life. Think about how much easier things will be when you don't have to worry about maintaining all this stuff. You could travel, take classes, maybe even date again. The suggestion that she might date again at 72 would have been amusing under different circumstances. Instead, Dorothy felt a growing irritation at the way her children kept discussing her future, as if she had no agency in determining it herself. "What if I changed my mind about moving?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. There was a pause before Michael responded. "What do you mean?" "What if I decided I wanted to stay in the house? What if I hired someone to help with maintenance and organization instead of selling everything?" "Mom, we've talked about this. The house is too big for you, and you've got way too much stuff. It's not safe or practical. Besides, think about the money you'd save by downsizing. You could have a really comfortable retirement if you sell the house and simplify your life." Dorothy almost laughed at the irony. If the jewelry collection was worth what Aunt Evelyn's letter suggested, her financial situation was far more secure than any of them realized. She didn't need to sell her house to fund a comfortable retirement. She could afford to hire help, to maintain her collections, to live exactly as she pleased without anyone's input or approval. "I just think I should take more time to consider my options," Dorothy said carefully. "Mom, you've had 8 years to consider your options. Dad wouldn't want you living alone in that big house, surrounded by all that clutter. He'd want you to be practical about your situation." The invocation of Frank's memory stung, particularly because Dorothy suspected Michael was wrong. Frank had understood her attachment to meaningful objects, her need to preserve family history and beautiful things. He had never pressured her to simplify or downsize, never suggested that her collections were problematic or embarrassing. After Michael hung up, Dorothy sat in her kitchen as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting different shadows across her table and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. She felt as if she was standing at a crossroads, with paths leading in directions she hadn't previously considered. For months, she had been allowing her family to shape her future, accepting their assessment of her situation and their recommendations for her next steps. She had internalized their criticism of her possessions and their assumptions about what was best for her. But the discovery in the music box had shifted something fundamental in her perspective. She wasn't a helpless elderly woman who needed to be managed and guided toward practical decisions. She was the inheritor of a family legacy that her descendants didn't understand or appreciate. She was the keeper of treasures that others dismissed as worthless, the guardian of stories that connected her to women who had faced their own challenges with wisdom and grace. Dorothy opened the music box one more time, listening to the broken melody of For Elise while she considered her options. She could tell her family about the hidden compartment and watch them suddenly develop respect for the box they had been eager to discard. She could have the collection appraised and use the knowledge of its value to assert her independence and financial security. Or she could keep the secret for now, using the time to figure out exactly what she wanted to do with this unexpected gift from the past. As the music played its faltering tune, Dorothy realized that for the first time in months, she felt genuinely hopeful about her future. She wasn't trapped by her circumstances or limited by other people's expectations. She was the owner of hidden treasures and the author of her own story, with more options than anyone realized. The music box closed with a soft click, its secrets safely concealed once again. But Dorothy knew that everything had changed. She was no longer the woman who had felt overwhelmed by her possessions and pressured by her family's plans. She was the great-granddaughter of a jewelry maker's daughter, the inheritor of beauty and value that had been preserved through generations of wise women. And unlike her family, she understood that the most precious things are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone who knows how to look beyond surface appearances to discover the treasures beneath. Dorothy spent the next 3 days in a state of quiet transformation that her family would have found impossible to recognize. She moved through her daily routines with newfound purpose, but kept her discovery completely to herself. Each morning she would sit with her coffee and open the music box, not to listen to the broken melody, but to remind herself that things were not always what they appeared to be. The jewelry remained safely hidden in its secret compartment, but Dorothy had photographed each piece with her phone, marveling at how the camera captured details that were difficult to see with the naked eye. The emerald brooch was particularly stunning when enlarged on her screen, the intricate metalwork surrounding the stones revealing craftsmanship that spoke of old-world artistry and considerable expense. She had also researched the appraiser mentioned in Aunt Evelyn's documents, discovering that Margaret Chen was not only still practicing, but had become one of the most respected antique jewelry experts in the Midwest. Her certification credentials were impeccable, and her client testimonials spoke of both expertise and discretion. Dorothy had spent an hour on Margaret's website, reading about the process of professional appraisal and the importance of proper documentation for insurance and estate planning purposes. The more she learned, the more she understood that Aunt Evelyn had been far more sophisticated in her planning than anyone in the family had realized. The insurance policy alone demonstrated a level of foresight that contradicted the family narrative of Evelyn as an eccentric old woman with too many possessions. Evelyn had been protecting and preserving family assets, while everyone else dismissed her collections as clutter. On Thursday afternoon, Dorothy made a decision that would have shocked her children. Instead of waiting for their scheduled sorting session, she called Margaret Chen's office and scheduled an appointment for a private consultation. She explained that she had inherited some antique jewelry and wanted to understand its historical and monetary value. Margaret's assistant was professional and accommodating, scheduling Dorothy for the following Tuesday at Margaret's private office in downtown Columbus. The act of making the appointment felt revolutionary. For months, Dorothy had been passively accepting other people's plans for her life, allowing Susan and Michael to dictate timelines and priorities that served their needs rather than her own. Now, for the first time since Frank's death, she was taking independent action based on her own interests and curiosity. Friday morning brought another phone call from Susan, this one more urgent than previous conversations. "Mom, I've been thinking about our timeline, and I really think we need to move faster on this whole process. I have a client who's very interested in houses in your neighborhood, and the market is so competitive right now. If we could get your house on the market within the next month, I think we could get asking price, or maybe even better." Dorothy listened to Susan's breathless enthusiasm while watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside her kitchen window. The bright red bird picked delicately at the seeds, completely focused on its own needs and oblivious to the human drama unfolding just a few feet away. "A month seems very rushed," Dorothy said mildly. "I know it sounds fast, but think about it, Mom. The sooner you sell, the sooner you can start your new life. And honestly, the sorting will go much quicker than you think once we get started. Most of this stuff can probably go straight to donation bins." Dorothy thought about the emerald brooch hidden in her music box, worth more than Susan probably made in several months of real estate commissions. "What if some of my things are more valuable than you realize?" Susan laughed, the sound tinged with affectionate condescension. "Mom, I know you're attached to your collections, but realistically, most antiques aren't worth very much anymore. The market has really shifted toward modern, minimalist aesthetics. Unless you're hiding some major museum pieces, we're probably looking at garage sale prices for most items." The irony was so pronounced that Dorothy had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. "I suppose you could be right. Trust me, I deal with estate sales all the time. People always think their grandmother's china or their father's tools are worth a fortune, but the reality is that younger generations just don't want that stuff anymore. The best thing you can do is donate it to charity and take the tax deduction." After Susan hung up, Dorothy sat in her kitchen, feeling a strange mixture of amusement and sadness. Her daughter's certainty about the worthlessness of older items reflected a broader cultural shift that Dorothy had observed throughout her teaching career. Each generation seemed increasingly disconnected from the material culture of their predecessors, viewing antiques and family heirlooms as burdens rather than treasures. But Dorothy's discovery had reminded her that previous generations had often been far more sophisticated than their descendants realized. Her great-grandmother had possessed both the means to acquire valuable jewelry and the wisdom to preserve it for future generations. Aunt Evelyn had maintained and protected that legacy while also ensuring proper insurance and documentation. The fact that subsequent family members had failed to recognize or appreciate these efforts didn't diminish their significance. Saturday arrived with an unexpected complication. Dorothy had been dreading the family sorting session that Susan had proposed, but she had also been curious to see how her newfound knowledge would affect her interactions with her children. However, at 9 o'clock that morning, Susan called to postpone. "I'm so sorry, Mom, but I have to show houses all day. This client is only in town for the weekend, and she's very serious about making an offer on something. Can we reschedule for next Saturday?" Dorothy felt a wave of relief that surprised her with its intensity. "Of course. Next weekend is fine." "Great. And Mom, maybe you could use this week to start going through some of the smaller items on your own. Just to get a head start on the process. Focus on things that are obviously not worth keeping. Obviously not worth keeping." Dorothy's gaze fell on the music box, sitting innocently on her counter while concealing treasures that could fund years of comfortable living. "I'll see what I can do." The postponement gave Dorothy an unexpected gift of time, which she decided to use for research and preparation. She spent Saturday afternoon at the Millbrook Public Library, using their computers to investigate antique jewelry markets and auction results. What she discovered was both fascinating and encouraging. The market for high-quality antique jewelry had actually strengthened in recent years, driven by collectors who appreciated the craftsmanship and materials that were no longer economically viable in modern production. Pieces from the Victorian era, particularly those with provable provenance and proper documentation, commanded substantial prices at auction houses and specialty dealers. More importantly, Dorothy learned about the process of establishing provenance and authenticity for inherited pieces. Aunt Evelyn's careful documentation would be invaluable in this process, providing the kind of chain of custody that serious collectors and institutions required. The insurance policy from 1988 would serve as additional verification of the collection's legitimacy and value. Dorothy also discovered that Margaret Chen had recently been featured in a magazine article about the growing market for antique jewelry among younger collectors who were seeking alternatives to mass-produced modern pieces. The article described Margaret as someone who specialized in helping families understand and properly value inherited collections, often revealing hidden treasures that had been dismissed or overlooked by previous generations. Sunday brought an unexpected visitor. Rosa Martinez, Dorothy's next-door neighbor and one of her few remaining close friends, stopped by with a casserole and her characteristic blend of curiosity and concern. "I saw Susan's car here several times this week," Rosa said, settling into her usual chair at Dorothy's kitchen table. "Everything okay?" Dorothy had known Rosa for 15 years, ever since Rosa and her husband had moved into the house next door. They had bonded over their shared love of gardening and their similar experiences as widows trying to maintain their independence in a world that often seemed designed for couples. Rosa was one of the few people who appreciated Dorothy's collections and understood her attachment to meaningful objects. "They want me to sell the house and move to a senior apartment," Dorothy said, pouring Rosa a cup of coffee. "They think I have too much stuff and can't manage on my own anymore." Rosa frowned, looking around the kitchen, which was admittedly crowded but perfectly functional. "Do you want to move?" The question was so simple and direct that it caught Dorothy off guard. For months, everyone had been discussing whether she should move, what kind of place would be best for her, and how quickly the transition should happen. But no one had actually asked what she wanted to do. "I don't know," Dorothy admitted. "I love this house, but they're probably right that it's getting to be too much for me. And I do have a lot of things that I probably don't need." "But do you want to get rid of them?" Rosa asked. "Or do you feel like you should want to get rid of them?" Dorothy considered the question while watching Rosa examine the music box, which was sitting on the table between them. Rosa had always admired the intricate inlay work and had often commented on how beautiful the piece was, even when the music mechanism wasn't working properly. "I found something interesting this week," Dorothy said impulsively, surprising herself with the decision to confide in Rosa. "Something that changes how I think about my situation." Rosa raised an eyebrow, setting down her coffee cup with renewed attention. "Oh? Dorothy retrieved the music box and, after a moment's hesitation, demonstrated the hidden compartment mechanism. Rosa watched with fascination as the false bottom revealed the concealed jewelry collection, her eyes widening as Dorothy carefully removed each piece and spread them across the table. "My God, Dorothy," Rosa breathed, leaning forward to examine the emerald brooch. "These are gorgeous. Are they real?" Dorothy shared Aunt Evelyn's letter and the appraisal documents, watching Rosa's expression shift from amazement to understanding as the full implications of the discovery became clear. "So your family wants you to get rid of the box that contains a collection worth tens of thousands of dollars," Rosa said slowly. "And they have no idea what they're asking you to throw away." "They think it's junk," Dorothy confirmed. "Susan specifically mentioned it as an example of the kind of thing I need to get rid of." Rosa sat back in her chair, shaking her head. "What are you going to do?" It was another simple, direct question that no one else had thought to ask. Susan and Michael had been full of advice and plans and timelines, but they hadn't actually consulted Dorothy about her preferences or goals. They had assumed they knew what was best for her, and had proceeded to implement their plans without considering that she might have her own ideas about her future. "I have an appointment with an appraiser next week," Dorothy said. "I want to know exactly what these pieces are worth and what my options are before I make any decisions about anything." Rosa nodded approvingly. "That's smart. And Dorothy, even if the jewelry wasn't valuable, you shouldn't let anyone pressure you into getting rid of things that matter to you. This is your life and your house and your stuff. You get to decide what happens to it." The conversation with Rosa clarified something that had been building in Dorothy's mind throughout the week. The discovery of the hidden jewelry collection wasn't just about money, though the financial security it represented was certainly significant. It was about agency and autonomy and the right to make her own decisions about her life and possessions. For months, she had been allowing other people to define her situation and her options. She had accepted their assessment that she was becoming a burden, that her possessions were problematic, and that she needed to be guided toward more practical living arrangements. But the jewelry collection was proof that their assessments weren't always accurate, that they didn't understand the true value of what they were asking her to discard. More importantly, the collection connected her to a lineage of strong, intelligent women who had faced their own challenges with wisdom and foresight. Her great-grandmother had preserved beauty and value through immigration and social upheaval. Aunt Evelyn had maintained and protected that legacy while ensuring proper documentation and insurance. Both women had understood that independence sometimes required hidden resources and careful planning. Dorothy was their inheritor not just of valuable objects, but of their approach to life. They had been women who kept their own counsel, who made strategic decisions based on their own understanding of their circumstances, and who preserved what mattered to them regardless of what others thought was appropriate or practical. As Rosa helped her carefully return the jewelry to its hiding place, Dorothy felt a sense of connection to those previous generations that she hadn't experienced since Aunt Evelyn's death. She was not a helpless elderly woman who needed to be managed and guided. She was the keeper of family treasures and family wisdom, the inheritor of strategies for maintaining independence and dignity in the face of pressure to conform to other people's expectations. Monday morning brought a phone call from Michael, who sounded more irritated than concerned. "Mom, Susan told me you canceled the sorting session for this weekend. We really need to get this process moving." "We didn't cancel," Dorothy corrected. "Susan postponed because she had to work. We're rescheduled for next Saturday." "Right, but the point is, we're losing time. And honestly, Mom, I'm a little concerned that you're having second thoughts about the whole moving plan. Susan said you asked some questions about staying in the house." Dorothy looked out her kitchen window at the bird feeder, where a blue jay was aggressively defending his territory against a squirrel. "I'm just making sure I consider all my options before making such a big decision." "What options?" "Mom, you're 72 years old, living alone in a house that's way too big for you, surrounded by stuff you never use. There aren't really any other reasonable options." The dismissive tone in Michael's voice triggered something in Dorothy that surprised her with its intensity. "How do you know what I use and don't use? How do you know what's reasonable for my situation?" There was a pause before Michael responded, his voice taking on the patient tone he might use with a confused child. "Mom, we're just trying to help you. Dad would want us to make sure you're safe and comfortable. The invocation of Frank's memory felt manipulative in a way that hadn't bothered Dorothy before, but now made her actively angry. Your father respected my judgment and my independence. He never pressured me to get rid of things that mattered to me. That was different. Dad was there to help you manage everything. Now you're on your own, and it's becoming a safety issue. Susan said you can barely navigate through some of the rooms because of all the clutter. Dorothy almost laughed at the exaggeration. While her house was certainly full, she had clear pathways through every room and knew exactly where everything was located. Susan's characterization of the situation as a safety hazard was dramatic license designed to support her argument for immediate action. I think I'm capable of assessing my own safety, Dorothy said firmly. Are you? Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you're in denial about how overwhelming your situation has become. Mom, we love you, and we want what's best for you, but you have to be realistic about your limitations. After Michael hung up, Dorothy sat in her kitchen, feeling a familiar sense of being diminished and dismissed. But this time, instead of internalizing the criticism and beginning to doubt herself, she felt a growing certainty that her children's assessment of her situation was both incomplete and self-serving. They weren't concerned about her safety or her happiness. They were concerned about their own convenience and their eventual inheritance. They wanted her to simplify her life so that they wouldn't have to deal with the complexity of her possessions when she died. They wanted her to move to a manageable apartment so they wouldn't have to worry about house maintenance and unexpected crises. Their plans for her future were designed to minimize their own stress and responsibility, not to maximize her comfort and autonomy. They had convinced themselves that what was convenient for them was also what was best for her. But Dorothy was beginning to understand that those two things were not necessarily the same. Tuesday's appointment with Margaret Chen would provide her with crucial information about her financial options and the true value of her inheritance. But regardless of what the appraiser told her, Dorothy had already made one important decision. She would not allow her children to pressure her into choices that served their needs at the expense of her own preferences and dignity. She was the great-granddaughter of a jewelry maker's daughter, and the beloved niece of a woman who had understood the importance of hidden resources and independent thinking. It was time to honor that legacy by making her own decisions about her own life, regardless of what anyone else thought was reasonable or practical. Margaret Chen's office occupied the third floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Columbus, its tall windows overlooking the bustling streets below. Dorothy had arrived 15 minutes early for her appointment, using the extra time to compose herself and organize the documents she had brought along. The jewelry pieces were carefully wrapped in soft cloth and secured in a small padded box that had once held Frank's reading glasses. The office itself was a testament to Margaret's expertise, with glass display cases containing examples of antique jewelry from various periods and regions. Dorothy found herself drawn to a particular case that held Victorian-era pieces remarkably similar to what she had discovered in her music box. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and the small placards beneath each piece indicated values that made Dorothy's heart race with anticipation. Mrs. Williams? Margaret Chen appeared in the doorway, a petite woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I'm so pleased to meet you. Please, come into my office. Margaret's private office was both professional and welcoming, with a large desk equipped with specialized lighting and magnification equipment. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with reference materials on jewelry history, gemology, and antique authentication. A comfortable seating area near the window provided a space for consultations that felt more like friendly conversations than business transactions. I understand you have some inherited pieces you'd like to have evaluated, Margaret said, gesturing for Dorothy to take a seat across from her desk. Can you tell me a bit about their history? Dorothy began with the story of Aunt Evelyn and the music box, explaining how the hidden compartment had been discovered and what documentation she had found along with the jewelry. Margaret listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, family history, and the circumstances of the inheritance. The documentation you've described is quite valuable, Margaret said when Dorothy finished her account. Provenance is crucial in establishing both authenticity and value for antique pieces. The fact that your aunt maintained insurance and had the pieces professionally appraised shows remarkable foresight. Dorothy carefully removed the jewelry from her padded box, placing each piece on the soft cloth that Margaret had spread across her desk. The emerald brooch looked even more impressive under the professional lighting, its green stones catching the light with an intensity that seemed almost alive. Margaret began her examination with the brooch, using a jeweler's loupe to study the stones and metalwork with practiced precision. She worked in focused silence, occasionally making notes on a pad beside her. Dorothy watched nervously, trying to read Margaret's expression for clues about what she was discovering. "This is quite exceptional," Margaret finally said, looking up from her examination. "The emeralds are genuine Colombian stones, and the quality is superior to most pieces I see from this period. The setting is 18-karat gold, and the workmanship suggests European craftsmanship, possibly German or Austrian." She moved on to the earrings, spending considerable time examining the unusual pink-orange stones. These are indeed Podparaja sapphires, which are quite rare and highly prized by collectors. The color is exceptional, and the clarity is remarkable for stones of this age. The bracelet received similar attention, with Margaret consulting several reference books to identify the maker's mark that Dorothy hadn't even noticed. This appears to be the work of Heinrich Zimmermann, a German craftsman who was active in the late 1800s. His pieces are extremely sought after by collectors of European jewelry. After completing her initial examination, Margaret sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Williams, what you have here is a collection of museum-quality pieces. The 1987 appraisal value of $8,000 for the brooch alone was quite accurate for that time period. In today's market, I would estimate the brooch at somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000. Dorothy felt the room spin slightly as she processed this information. $25,000? At minimum, Margaret confirmed. The earrings would likely appraise in the $15,000 to $20,000 range, and the bracelet, being a documented Zimmermann piece, could easily bring $12,000 to $15,000. As a collection, we're looking at a total value of $50,000 to $65,000, possibly more if we can establish additional provenance through auction records or museum catalogs." The numbers seemed surreal to Dorothy, who had been living on a modest teacher's pension and Frank's Social Security benefits. This single collection, hidden in a music box that her family wanted to donate to charity, represented more money than she had ever possessed at one time. "There's something else you should know," Margaret continued. "The insurance policy your aunt maintained would have increased in value over the years. If the policy is still active, it would likely cover the current appraised value, not the 1987 assessment. You should contact the insurance company to verify the policy status." Dorothy spent another hour with Margaret, discussing options for formal appraisal, insurance updates, and potential sale venues if she chose to liquidate any of the pieces. Margaret provided her with detailed written estimates and recommended several auction houses that specialized in antique jewelry if Dorothy decided to sell. As Dorothy left Margaret's office, she felt fundamentally changed by the experience. The music box that her family had dismissed as worthless junk contained a treasure that could provide financial security for the rest of her life. More importantly, it represented a connection to family history and female wisdom that completely reframed her understanding of her own heritage and capabilities. The drive back to Millbrook gave Dorothy time to process the implications of Margaret's appraisal. She was not a helpless elderly woman who needed to be guided toward practical decisions about her future. She was the owner of significant assets and the inheritor of a legacy that her family had completely failed to understand or appreciate. That evening, Dorothy sat in her kitchen with the music box open before her, listening to the broken melody of Fur Elise while she considered her options. The jewelry was safely hidden in its secret compartment, but the knowledge of its value had fundamentally altered her relationship with her family's expectations and demands. She could tell them about the discovery and watch their attitudes toward her possessions change instantly. She could use the financial security to maintain her independence and resist their pressure to downsize. Or she could continue to keep the secret while she determined exactly what kind of future she wanted to create for herself. Wednesday morning brought the inevitable phone call from Susan, who sounded more impatient than usual. Mom, I need to know if you're serious about this move, or if you're just going to keep delaying everything indefinitely. I have clients who are interested in your neighborhood, and I need to give them some kind of timeline. Dorothy listened to her daughter's frustrated tone while examining the emerald brooch under her kitchen light. The stone seemed to glow with inner fire, beautiful and valuable in ways that Susan couldn't begin to imagine. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the value of my possessions, Dorothy said carefully. You mentioned that most antiques aren't worth very much anymore. That's right, Susan confirmed. The market has really shifted. Unless you have something truly exceptional, you're probably better off donating most of it and taking the tax deduction. What would you consider truly exceptional? Susan laughed, though not unkindly. Mom, I'm talking about museum-quality pieces, things with documented provenance and professional authentication. The kind of stuff that gets sold at major auction houses, not the things people pick up at estate sales. Dorothy smiled, thinking about Heinrich Zimmermann's Maker's Mark and the Colombian emeralds that Margaret had examined so carefully. I see. Look, I know you're attached to some of these things, but you have to be realistic about their actual value. That music box you're so fond of, for instance. It's charming, but it's not exactly Sotheby's material. No, I suppose not, Dorothy agreed, her voice carefully neutral. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Susan outlining her plans for marketing the house and her timeline for getting Dorothy moved into a senior apartment. Dorothy made appropriate responses while studying the documentation Margaret had provided, including contact information for several auction houses that regularly handled collections of this caliber. After Susan hung up, Dorothy made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. She called Margaret Chen's office and scheduled a follow-up appointment to discuss the process of obtaining formal appraisals for insurance and potential sale purposes. She also requested recommendations for attorneys who specialized in estate planning and asset protection. For the first time in months, Dorothy felt genuinely excited about her future. She didn't need to sell her house to achieve financial security. She didn't need to downsize her possessions to prove her competence. She didn't need to accept her family's assessment of her situation or their plans for her life. The rest of the week passed in a blur of phone calls and appointments. Dorothy contacted the insurance company and discovered that Aunt Evelyn's policy was indeed still active and had been automatically transferred to her upon Evelyn's death. The current coverage was substantially higher than the 1987 values, reflecting decades of automatic adjustments for inflation and market changes. She met with David Thompson, the estate attorney Margaret had recommended, and discussed options for updating her will and establishing trusts that would protect her assets while ensuring they would eventually benefit people who would appreciate their value. David was particularly interested in the family history behind the collection and suggested that Dorothy might want to consider donating certain pieces to museums while retaining others for personal enjoyment. Most importantly, Dorothy began to envision a future that reflected her own preferences rather than her family's expectations. She could afford to hire help for house maintenance and organization. She could travel if she wanted to, or take classes, or simply continue living exactly as she pleased without anyone's approval or assistance. Saturday arrived with the rescheduled family sorting session, but Dorothy was no longer dreading the encounter. She had spent the morning organizing her thoughts and preparing for what she suspected would be a difficult conversation. The music box sat on her kitchen table, its secrets safely hidden while she waited for her family to arrive. Susan arrived first, armed with boxes and donation bags, and a clipboard full of lists. Michael followed shortly after, with Jessica and Tyler trailing behind, looking resigned to spending their Saturday dealing with what they clearly viewed as an unpleasant chore. Okay, Mom, Susan said, settling into her familiar take-charge mode. I thought we'd start with the obvious things and work our way through the house systematically. Jessica brought her phone so we can look up values for anything that seems questionable. But honestly, I think we'll find that most things fall into the donation category. Dorothy nodded pleasantly, watching her family spread out through her kitchen and living room, already beginning to make decisions about her possessions. Jessica was photographing various items, presumably to research their resale value online. Tyler was stacking magazines and newspapers, clearly assuming they were destined for recycling. Michael was examining her collection of vintage kitchen appliances with the expression of someone calculating disposal costs. "What about this?" Susan asked, picking up the music box from the table. "I know you're attached to it, but realistically, Mom, where would you put it in a small apartment? And it doesn't even work properly anymore." Dorothy watched her daughter handle the music box with casual indifference, oblivious to the fortune concealed within its familiar wooden case. "It has sentimental value." "I understand that," Susan said with practiced patience. "But you can't keep everything just because it reminds you of someone. Maybe we could take a photo of it so you can remember it without having to store it." Jessica looked up from her phone, where she had been researching vintage music boxes. "Yeah, Grandma, I found some similar ones online, and they're really not worth much. Like, maybe $50 if you're lucky. And that's for ones that actually work." Dorothy felt a moment of crystalline clarity as she watched her family dismiss the music box with the same casual certainty they had shown toward all of her possessions. They were so confident in their assessment, so sure of their understanding of value and worth, that they couldn't imagine they might be wrong. "Actually," Dorothy said quietly, "I'd like to keep that one." Susan sighed, the sound heavy with frustrated patience. "Mom, this is exactly the kind of thinking that got you into this situation in the first place. You can't keep everything. You have to make some hard choices about what's really important." "I think I'm capable of determining what's important to me," Dorothy replied, her voice calm but firm. Michael looked up from his examination of the appliances, sensing tension in the conversation. "Mom, we're just trying to help you be practical. In a senior apartment, you'll have maybe a quarter of the space you have now. You literally can't take everything with you." "What if I decided not to move to a senior apartment?" Dorothy asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Susan set down the music box and turned to face her mother fully, her expression shifting from patient to concerned to slightly annoyed. "Mom, we've been through this. You can't stay in this house. It's too big, too much work, and you have way too much stuff. It's not practical or safe." "What if I hired help? For cleaning and maintenance?" "With what money?" Susan asked, her tone becoming sharper. "Mom, you're living on a fixed income. You can't afford to hire help and maintain this house. That's why selling it makes sense. You need the money for your retirement." Dorothy stood up and walked to the music box, placing her hands protectively on its wooden surface. "What if I told you that I have more financial resources than you realize?" "What do you mean?" Michael asked, his attention now fully focused on the conversation. Dorothy looked around the room at her family members, all of whom had stopped their sorting activities to stare at her. Jessica had lowered her phone, Tyler had abandoned his stack of magazines, and Susan was watching her with the expression of someone dealing with a potentially delusional relative. "I mean that you've been making assumptions about my financial situation that aren't necessarily accurate," Dorothy said carefully. Susan's expression shifted to something that might have been concern or might have been calculation. "Mom, do you have some kind of hidden account we don't know about? Because if you do, that's something we need to discuss with your financial advisor." "I don't have a financial advisor," Dorothy said. "I have an estate attorney, and I've been working with a professional appraiser to evaluate some of my possessions." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Dorothy could see her family processing this information, trying to understand what she was telling them and what it might mean for their carefully laid plans. "An appraiser?" Jessica asked, her voice uncertain. "For what?" Dorothy opened the music box and demonstrated the hidden compartment mechanism, watching her family's faces as the secret panel revealed the jewelry collection that had been concealed beneath their noses for 15 years. The emerald brooch caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window, its green stones glowing with unmistakable value. "Oh my God," Susan breathed, reaching toward the brooch before catching herself. "Are those real?" According to Margaret Chen, one of the most respected antique jewelry appraisers in the Midwest, they are not only real, but extremely valuable, Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "The brooch alone is worth approximately $25,000 to $30,000. The collection as a whole is valued between $50,000 and $65,000. The silence that followed was profound. Dorothy watched her family stare at the jewelry spread across her kitchen table, their expressions shifting from disbelief to understanding to something that might have been embarrassment. "You were going to let us donate this to charity," Michael said slowly, his voice containing a mixture of awe and accusation. "You were insisting that I donate it to charity," Dorothy corrected. "You were telling me it was worthless junk that I needed to get rid of." Susan picked up the emerald brooch with trembling hands, examining it as if she had never seen it before. "Mom, why didn't you tell us about this?" "Because you never asked," Dorothy replied simply. "You assumed you knew the value of my possessions without actually investigating what they were. You assumed that because I'm elderly and sentimental, I couldn't possibly own anything of genuine worth." Jessica was photographing the jewelry with her phone, her previous dismissive attitude replaced by obvious fascination. "Grandma, this is incredible. Do you have any idea how much this changes things?" "It changes everything," Dorothy said, carefully returning the pieces to their hidden compartment. "It means I have the financial resources to live exactly as I choose, without anyone's approval or assistance. It means I don't need to sell my house, or downsize my possessions, or accept anyone else's assessment of what's practical for my situation." Tyler, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "So you're not moving?" Dorothy looked around her kitchen, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of the home she had shared with Frank for 35 years. "I haven't decided yet, but when I do decide, it will be based on what I want, not what other people think is best for me." Susan set down the brooch and sat heavily in her chair, her professional composure finally cracking. "Mom, I'm sorry. I had no idea. If I had known—" "If you had known what?" Dorothy asked gently. "That I owned valuable things? Would that have changed how you treated me? Or would it have just changed how you treated my possessions?" The question hung in the air, unanswered because they all knew the answer. Dorothy's value in their eyes had been tied to her usefulness to them, not to her inherent worth as a person. The discovery of the jewelry collection had changed their perception of her financial situation, but it had also revealed the superficial nature of their concern for her welfare. "I think," Dorothy said quietly, "that you all need to go home and think about what you want from a relationship with me. Not what you want from my house or my possessions or my estate, but what you want from me as a person." She stood up and walked to the front door, holding it open in a gesture that was both gracious and unmistakably final. "When you're ready to treat me as someone whose opinions and preferences matter, someone whose judgment you respect, then we can have another conversation. Until then, I think it's best if we take a break from discussing my living situation." Her family filed out slowly, each offering awkward hugs and promises to call soon. Susan lingered longest, clearly wanting to discuss the jewelry collection further, but Dorothy's expression discouraged additional conversation. After they left, Dorothy returned to her kitchen and sat down at the table where the music box waited. She opened it and listened to the broken melody of "For Elise," but this time the faltering notes didn't sound sad or damaged. They sounded like a song of independence, a celebration of hidden treasures finally revealed. Over the following weeks, Dorothy received several phone calls from her family members, each attempting to rebuild the relationship on terms that acknowledged her autonomy and financial independence. Susan called to apologize for her assumptions and to offer her services as a realtor if Dorothy ever decided to sell the house, but without the pressure and timelines that had characterized their previous conversations. Michael visited one evening, bringing takeout dinner and a willingness to listen to Dorothy's stories about Aunt Evelyn and the family history he had never bothered to learn. Jessica sent a thoughtful card acknowledging her grandmother's wisdom and asking if she would be willing to share more family stories in the future. Only Tyler seemed unchanged by the revelation, continuing to treat Dorothy with the same quiet respect he had always shown. During one of his visits, he confided that he had never understood why everyone was so eager to change her living situation. "You seemed happy here," he said simply. "I never understood why that wasn't enough for them." Dorothy used her newfound financial security to hire Rosa's nephew to help with house maintenance, and to arrange for a cleaning service to come twice a month. She kept the jewelry collection safely hidden in the music box, but she had formal appraisals completed for insurance purposes and updated her will to ensure that the pieces would eventually go to people who would appreciate their historical and artistic value. She also began researching her family genealogy, discovering that her great-grandmother had indeed been connected to a family of jewelry makers in Bavaria. The discovery added another layer of meaning to the collection and reinforced Dorothy's understanding that she was the inheritor of a legacy that extended far beyond monetary value. On a warm spring evening, Dorothy sat on her front porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood she had called home for decades. The music box was inside on the kitchen table, its secrets safely concealed but its lesson finally learned. The most precious things in life were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone wise enough to look beyond surface appearances to discover the treasures beneath. She had learned that value couldn't be measured only in dollars and cents, but also in wisdom, independence, and the courage to honor one's own judgment even when others disagreed. She had learned that love without respect was merely obligation, and that true family members were those who valued her for herself, not for what she could provide them. Most importantly, she had learned that it was never too late to choose yourself, to stand up for your own worth, and to insist on being treated with the dignity and respect that every person deserved, regardless of their age or circumstances. The music box continued to play its broken melody, but Dorothy no longer heard it as a song of damage or loss. It was a song of resilience, of beauty that endured despite imperfection, of treasures that remained valuable even when others failed to recognize their worth. And in the fading light of that spring evening, Dorothy smiled, knowing that she had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that the most precious things in life are often the ones that others dismiss as worthless, and that the greatest treasure of all is the courage to value yourself exactly as you are. 6 months after the revelation that changed everything, Dorothy Williams stood in the sunroom she had always dreamed of adding to her house. The contractor had finished the work just last week, and morning light now streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the easel where she had resumed the painting hobby she had abandoned 40 years earlier. Her first completed canvas depicted the view from her kitchen window, complete with the cardinal that still visited her bird feeder every morning. The house felt different now, not because she had gotten rid of possessions, but because she had selectively organized and displayed them with intention rather than accumulation. The emerald brooch now resided in a climate-controlled shadow box in her living room, alongside a detailed placard explaining its history and the story of her great-grandmother's journey from Bavaria. Museum curators who had visited to examine the Zimmermann bracelet had suggested this approach, helping Dorothy transform her home into a personal gallery that honored both beauty and history. Rosa Martinez knocked on the front door precisely at 10 o'clock, as she had every Tuesday morning since Dorothy had started her weekly coffee gatherings. What had begun as conversations between two neighbors had evolved into a small salon of local women who shared Dorothy's appreciation for history, art, and meaningful conversation. Today's group would include Mrs. Chen from the library, Patricia from the garden club, and Sarah, a young graduate student who was writing her thesis on women's economic strategies in immigrant families. "The sunroom looks magnificent," Rosa said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs Dorothy had chosen specifically for these gatherings. "I can't believe how much light it adds to the whole house." Dorothy poured coffee from the silver service she had inherited from her mother, another piece that her family had once dismissed as outdated and impractical. The weight of the silver pot felt substantial in her hands, a tangible connection to generations of women who had understood the importance of creating gracious spaces for community and conversation. "I keep thinking about what Susan said about having too much space," Dorothy mused, arranging homemade scones on a plate that had belonged to Aunt Evelyn. She was right that the house was too big for just me. But the solution wasn't to make my life smaller. It was to fill the space with more meaningful activity. The other women arrived in quick succession, each bringing their own contributions to the morning's discussion. Mrs. Chen had researched the historical context of Dorothy's jewelry collection and brought several books about 19th-century immigrant communities. Patricia carried sketches for the heritage garden they were planning for the community center, incorporating plants that would have been familiar to the German immigrants who settled the area. Sarah brought her laptop and a list of questions about Dorothy's family history that would inform her academic research. As the conversation flowed around her kitchen table, Dorothy reflected on how dramatically her social life had changed since she had stopped waiting for her family to include her in their plans. These women valued her knowledge, her experiences, and her perspectives. They asked her opinion about community issues and sought her advice on personal matters. Most importantly, they listened when she spoke, treating her words as contributions rather than interruptions. The music box sat in its place of honor on the kitchen counter, no longer hiding its secrets, but openly displaying its beauty. Dorothy had commissioned a local craftsman to repair the musical mechanism, and Fur Elise now played with crystalline perfection. The piece had become a conversation starter, prompting guests to share their own stories about family heirlooms and hidden treasures. "I received an interesting phone call yesterday," Dorothy told the group as they finished their scones and settled in for their weekly discussion. "The Smithsonian Museum has expressed interest in featuring my jewelry collection in an upcoming exhibition about immigrant women and economic resilience." The women around the table reacted with excitement and pride, understanding immediately the significance of this recognition. Sarah's eyes lit up with particular interest, as this development perfectly supported the arguments she was making in her thesis about women's strategies for preserving wealth and culture across generations. "Would you loan them the pieces?" Mrs. Chen asked. "I'm considering it," Dorothy replied. They would provide detailed documentation about the craftsmanship and historical context, which would add to our understanding of the family's story. And the exhibition would help other people recognize the value of objects they might be overlooking in their own families. Rosa smiled knowingly. "You're thinking about all those music boxes and jewelry collections sitting in attics and basements, being dismissed as worthless junk." "Exactly," Dorothy confirmed. "How many families are making the same assumptions my children made? How many treasures are being lost because no one takes the time to really investigate what they have?" The conversation turned to broader questions about how society valued the possessions and wisdom of elderly people. Patricia shared stories from her work with the Historical Society, describing families who had donated items without understanding their significance. Mrs. Chen talked about patrons who brought boxes of old books to the library, often containing first editions or rare manuscripts. "It's not just about monetary value," Sarah observed, taking notes for her research. "It's about the way we dismiss entire categories of knowledge and experience." Dorothy's story illustrates how ageism intersects with assumptions about worth and competence. Dorothy nodded, appreciating how the young scholar had articulated something she had felt but hadn't fully expressed. "My children's behavior wasn't malicious. They genuinely believed they were helping me, but they had internalized cultural messages about aging that made them see me as someone who needed to be managed rather than consulted." The morning discussion continued for another hour, covering topics that ranged from estate planning strategies to the importance of documenting family histories before older generations passed away. When the women finally departed, each taking leftover scones and promising to return the following week, Dorothy felt the familiar satisfaction that came from meaningful intellectual engagement. The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor. Jessica had been stopping by regularly since the jewelry revelation, initially driven by curiosity about the collection but gradually developing genuine interest in her grandmother's stories and perspectives. Today she arrived with a notebook and her laptop, prepared to continue the oral history project she had started at Dorothy's suggestion. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Jessica began, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. "About how each generation has to decide what to preserve and what to let go. I realize I've been really quick to dismiss things as outdated without understanding their context." Dorothy smiled, remembering her granddaughter's previous certainty about minimalist aesthetics and the importance of staying current with trends. It's natural for young people to want to create their own style and approach to life. The problem comes when we assume that everything from previous generations is automatically obsolete. Jessica opened her laptop and reviewed the notes from their previous conversations. She had been documenting not just the family history but also Dorothy's perspectives on aging, independence, and the evolution of women's roles across generations. What had started as a simple genealogy project had become a rich exploration of social change and continuity. "I wanted to ask you about something," Jessica said, her tone becoming more serious. "I've been talking to my friends about your story, and several of them have mentioned feeling pressure from their own families to live their lives in certain ways. Not about downsizing, obviously, since we're young, but about career choices and relationships and life goals. Dorothy poured fresh coffee and considered the parallel Jessica was drawing. What kind of pressure? Like, the assumption that they know what's best for us without really asking what we want, or dismissing our interests and preferences because they don't fit conventional expectations. Jessica paused, organizing her thoughts. I guess I'm realizing that the dynamic you experienced with Mom and Uncle Michael isn't just about aging. It's about how families sometimes use love as justification for control. The observation was perceptive and mature, showing how much Jessica had grown during their months of conversation. Dorothy felt proud of her granddaughter's developing analytical skills and her willingness to question assumptions she had previously accepted without examination. That's very insightful, Dorothy said. The challenge is learning to distinguish between guidance offered out of genuine care and pressure applied for the convenience of others. Sometimes the people who claim to know what's best for us are really advocating for what would be easiest for them. They spent the afternoon working on the oral history project, with Jessica asking detailed questions about Dorothy's teaching career, her marriage to Frank, and her relationship with Aunt Evelyn. The conversations revealed layers of family history that had never been shared with the younger generation, stories about resilience and adaptation that provided context for understanding Dorothy's current choices. As Jessica prepared to leave, she mentioned that she had been accepted into a graduate program in museum studies, inspired partly by her grandmother's story and partly by her growing appreciation for the ways objects could preserve and transmit cultural knowledge. I keep thinking about how close we came to losing the jewelry collection, Jessica said, packing up her recording equipment. If you had listened to us and donated the music box, those pieces would have ended up in some charity shop, and no one would have ever known their real value. Dorothy walked her granddaughter to the door, reflecting on how dramatically their relationship had evolved. Jessica now sought her advice on academic and personal matters, valued her insights about navigating family dynamics, and treated her as a source of wisdom rather than an obligation to manage. Evening brought solitude, but it was the comfortable solitude of someone who had chosen it rather than had it imposed upon her. Dorothy prepared a simple dinner and ate it in the sunroom, watching the play of light across her easel and planning her next painting project. The cardinal appeared at the feeder, now accompanied by a mate who had joined him sometime during the spring. The phone rang as she was cleaning up, displaying Susan's name on the caller ID. Their relationship had stabilized into something more respectful, but still somewhat cautious, as Susan continued to adjust to seeing her mother as an autonomous adult, rather than a responsibility to manage. Hi, Mom. Susan's voice was warm but carried the slight formality that had characterized their interactions since the jewelry revelation. I wanted to let you know that I have a client who's interested in commissioning a historical survey of the neighborhood. Would you be willing to talk to them about the area's development over the past few decades? Dorothy smiled at the request, which represented a significant shift in how Susan viewed her mother's knowledge and experience. I'd be happy to help. What kind of information are they looking for? They're particularly interested in the stories behind some of the older houses and the families who built the community. I thought you might have insights that wouldn't be available in official records. They discussed the project for several minutes, with Susan showing genuine interest in Dorothy's perspectives on the neighborhood's evolution. The conversation felt natural and respectful, a far cry from the patronizing tone that had characterized their discussions about downsizing and decluttering. After Susan hung up, Dorothy sat in her living room, looking at the emerald brooch in its display case. The piece caught the lamplight and threw tiny green reflections onto the wall, a daily reminder of the hidden treasures that surrounded everyone if they only knew how to look. She thought about the exhibition proposal from the Smithsonian and the educational impact it might have. How many people would see the collection and reconsider their own assumptions about the possessions of elderly relatives? How many families might take the time to research and document their heritage before dismissing it as worthless clutter? The music box sat nearby, its restored mechanism ready to play Fur Elise at the touch of a button. Dorothy opened it and listened to the perfect melody, remembering the broken tune that had once seemed like a metaphor for decline and obsolescence. The repair had revealed that the damage had been superficial, affecting only the surface mechanism while leaving the core structure intact and beautiful. The metaphor felt apt for her own transformation. Her family's dismissive treatment had made her feel broken and diminished, but the damage had been to her confidence rather than her fundamental worth. The discovery of the jewelry collection had provided the catalyst for recognizing her value, but that value had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged and celebrated. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Tyler stood on her front porch, holding a small wrapped package and wearing the shy smile that had characterized him since childhood. "I hope it's not too late to stop by," he said as Dorothy invited him in. "I made something for you in my workshop class, and I wanted to give it to you before I lost my nerve." Inside the package was a wooden box, clearly crafted by hand with careful attention to detail. The wood was polished to a warm glow, and the proportions were elegant and pleasing. But it was the interior that took Dorothy's breath away. Tyler had created a custom-fitted compartment system, designed specifically to hold and display her jewelry collection. "I measured the pieces when you showed them to us," Tyler explained, his words coming in a rush as he demonstrated how each piece fit perfectly into its designated space. "I thought you might want a way to display them safely, maybe when you have visitors or for special occasions." Dorothy examined the box carefully, running her fingers over the smooth joints and precise measurements. The craftsmanship was remarkable, showing not just technical skill, but genuine artistic vision. More importantly, it demonstrated that Tyler had been paying attention to her stories about the jewelry's significance and had wanted to honor that history with his own contribution. "Tyler, this is absolutely beautiful," Dorothy said, her voice thick with emotion. "The workmanship is exquisite, and the thoughtfulness behind it means more than I can express." They spent the next hour transferring the jewelry to its new display case, with Tyler explaining the design decisions he had made, and Dorothy sharing more stories about each piece's history. The emerald brooch looked magnificent against the dark wood lining, and the Padparaja sapphire earrings seemed to glow in their custom compartments. "I've been thinking about what happened when we all came over to sort through your stuff," Tyler said as they admired the completed display. "I felt really bad about how everyone acted, but I didn't know how to speak up at the time." Dorothy appreciated his honesty and his willingness to acknowledge the family's collective failure. "You were the only one who seemed uncomfortable with the whole process. I noticed that, and it mattered to me. I just kept thinking that if someone tried to tell me what to do with my things, I'd be really angry," Tyler continued. "And you weren't even angry. You were just sad." "That seemed worse somehow." The observation was mature and empathetic, showing how much Tyler had learned from watching the family dynamics unfold. Dorothy felt proud of his developing emotional intelligence and his willingness to take responsibility for his own behavior. As Tyler prepared to leave, he mentioned that he had been accepted into a 4-year program in furniture design and planned to specialize in custom pieces that honored traditional craftsmanship while incorporating contemporary functionality. "Working on your jewelry box made me realize how much I enjoy creating things that serve a specific purpose for a specific person," he said. "It feels more meaningful than just making generic furniture." After Tyler left, Dorothy placed the new jewelry box on her dining room table, where it could be easily seen and appreciated by visitors. The pieces looked magnificent in their custom setting, but more than that, they represented the evolution of her family relationships from dismissive to respectful. She opened the music box one final time that evening, listening to "Fur Elise" play with perfect clarity while she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this place of contentment and independence. The broken melody that had once made her feel sad now filled her with gratitude for the repairs that had restored not just the mechanism, but her faith in her own worth. As the final notes faded into silence, Dorothy smiled at the realization that her story was far from over. The woman who had felt invisible and undervalued just months earlier had become a community leader, a family historian, a potential museum contributor, and an inspiration to younger generations who were learning to question assumptions about age and worth. The music box closed with its familiar soft click, but Dorothy knew that its most important secret had already been revealed. The greatest treasure wasn't the valuable jewelry hidden in its compartments, but the lesson it had taught about looking beyond surface appearances to discover the riches that lay beneath. And in the quiet of her house, surrounded by objects that told stories of resilience and beauty and wisdom passed down through generations of strong women, Dorothy finally understood that she had always been the most precious treasure of all. 2 years had passed since Dorothy Williams first opened the hidden compartment that changed everything. And she stood now in the grand hall of the Smithsonian Institution, watching visitors examine her family's jewelry collection behind pristine glass cases. The exhibition, titled Hidden Treasures: Women's Economic Strategies Across Generations, had exceeded all expectations, drawing record crowds and sparking conversations about the often overlooked contributions of immigrant women to American prosperity. Dorothy wore the Zimmerman bracelet for the occasion, the only piece she had retained from the collection. The museum had created exact replicas for the exhibition, allowing her to keep this one meaningful connection to her great-grandmother while sharing the broader story with the world. The weight of the antique gold against her wrist felt like a blessing from generations of wise women who had understood the importance of preserving beauty and value for future generations. "Mrs. Williams, there's someone I'd like you to meet," said Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the curator who had worked with Dorothy to develop the exhibition. She approached with a distinguished elderly gentleman whose eyes held the same sharp intelligence that Dorothy recognized in herself. "This is Professor Emeritus James Kellerman from Georgetown University," Dr. Harper continued. "He's been studying your collection's documentation, particularly your aunt's insurance strategies and preservation methods." Professor Kellerman shook Dorothy's hand with obvious respect. "Mrs. Williams, your family's approach to asset preservation was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The combination of hidden storage, proper insurance, and documented provenance represents exactly the kind of strategic thinking that allowed immigrant families to build generational wealth." Dorothy smiled, thinking about how Aunt Evelyn would have appreciated this academic recognition of her foresight. "My aunt always said that the most important things were often the ones that others overlooked." I'm beginning to understand that she wasn't just talking about objects. The conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice calling her name. Dorothy turned to see Susan approaching, accompanied by a woman she didn't recognize. Her daughter looked elegant and professional, but more importantly, she looked genuinely proud as she made her way through the crowd. "Mom, I want you to meet Dr. Patricia Vance from the National Museum of Women's History," Susan said, her voice warm with genuine enthusiasm. "She's interested in featuring your story in their upcoming exhibition about women and financial independence." Dr. Vance was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent brown eyes. "Mrs. Williams, your story represents something we see far too rarely in historical narratives: an elderly woman asserting her agency and changing the trajectory of her own life. We'd love to include your experience in our exhibition about women who redefined their circumstances later in life." Dorothy found herself genuinely surprised by this development. The idea that her personal journey might inspire other women had occurred to her, but she hadn't expected it to attract attention from major institutions. "What kind of story would you want to tell?" "The complete narrative," Dr. Vance replied. "From the initial dismissal by family members, to the discovery of hidden assets, to your transformation into an independent community leader. But most importantly, we want to highlight how you used that discovery to reclaim your autonomy and create the life you actually wanted." They discussed the project for several minutes, with Dr. Vance explaining how Dorothy's story fit into broader patterns of women's empowerment and self-advocacy. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jessica, who had driven down from Ohio to attend the exhibition opening. "Grandma, you have to see this," Jessica said, practically bouncing with excitement, as she led Dorothy to a corner of the exhibition where visitor comments were displayed. "People have been writing the most incredible responses to your story." The comment board was covered with handwritten notes from visitors who had been moved by the exhibition's central narrative. Many were from older women who shared similar experiences of being undervalued or dismissed by family members. Others were from younger visitors who wrote about newfound respect for elderly relatives and their possessions. One comment particularly caught Dorothy's attention. "After seeing this exhibition, I called my grandmother and asked her to tell me about her jewelry collection. We spent 3 hours on the phone, and I learned family history I never knew existed. Thank you for showing me that I should listen more and assume less. Another read. I'm 68 and my children have been pressuring me to downsize. This exhibition gave me permission to take my time and make decisions based on what I want, not what's convenient for them. Dorothy felt tears forming as she read message after message from people who had found inspiration in her story. The hidden jewelry collection had been valuable, but its real worth lay in the lesson it had taught about recognizing and asserting one's own value. There's something else I want to show you, Jessica said, pulling out her phone and navigating to a website. Remember the oral history project we worked on? The university published it as part of their digital archive, and it's been getting a lot of attention. The website displayed Jessica's carefully researched family history, complete with photographs of the jewelry collection and detailed interviews with Dorothy about her experiences. But it had evolved beyond simple genealogy to become a case study in family dynamics, generational communication, and the intersection of aging with economic independence. My professor says it's being used in sociology classes to discuss ageism and family power dynamics, Jessica continued. And I've gotten emails from people all over the country who say it helped them understand their own family situations better. Dorothy marveled at how her personal story had rippled outward to touch lives she would never know. The music box that had once seemed like a burden had become a catalyst for conversations about respect, autonomy, and the hidden treasures that existed in families everywhere. The evening reception brought together scholars, museum professionals, and community members who had been following Dorothy's story since it first gained attention in local media. She found herself at the center of conversations about everything from estate planning to intergenerational communication to the preservation of cultural heritage. I have to admit something, Susan said during a quiet moment when they had stepped away from the crowd. When you first told us about the jewelry, I was embarrassed about how we had treated you, but now I'm proud of how you handled the whole situation. You could have used the discovery to make us feel terrible, but instead, you used it to teach us something important. Dorothy looked at her daughter, noting the genuine maturity in her expression. The goal was never to punish anyone. It was to help you understand that my opinions and preferences matter, regardless of my age or your assumptions about my competence. I get that now, Susan replied. And I've been thinking about how I want to handle my own aging differently. I don't want Tyler and Jessica to ever feel like they need to manage my life for me. The conversation was joined by Michael, who had arrived late due to work commitments, but had spent the past hour touring the exhibition with obvious pride. Mom, I keep thinking about that day when we came over to sort through your things. I was so sure we knew what was best for you. You meant well, Dorothy said gently, but good intentions don't always lead to respectful treatment. The most important thing is that you've learned to ask me what I want instead of telling me what I need. Tyler appeared at Dorothy's elbow, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing the same shy smile that had characterized him since childhood. Grandma, there's a reporter from the Washington Post who wants to interview you about the exhibition. Are you up for it? Dorothy accepted the wine and considered the request. 2 years ago, she would have deferred to her family's judgment about whether such attention was appropriate. Now she made her own decisions based on her own assessment of the situation. I'd be happy to speak with them, she said. This story deserves to be shared as widely as possible. The interview took place in a quiet corner of the museum, with Dorothy explaining not just the discovery of the jewelry, but the broader lessons about family communication and respect for elderly people's autonomy. The reporter was particularly interested in how Dorothy had used her newfound financial security to create the life she actually wanted, rather than the one others thought she should have. What would you say to other older adults who feel dismissed or undervalued by their families? The reporter asked. Dorothy considered the question carefully. I would tell them that their opinions matter, their preferences are valid, and their life experience has value. They don't need permission to live according to their own judgment, and they shouldn't accept disrespectful treatment just because it comes from people who claim to love them. She paused, thinking about the music box and the broken melody that had once seemed like a metaphor for decline. I would also tell them to look closely at what they already have. Sometimes the resources we need for independence are closer than we realize, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to recognize their worth. The evening concluded with Dorothy standing before the display case that held her great-grandmother's emerald brooch. The museum lighting made the stones glow with inner fire, and the accompanying placard told the story of 3 generations of women who had understood the importance of preserving beauty and value for the future. A young mother approached with her teenage daughter, both of them reading the placard with obvious interest. "Mom, this is like that old jewelry box Grandma has in her attic," the teenager said. "Maybe we should ask her about it instead of assuming it's just old junk." The mother nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. I keep thinking about what this exhibition says about really listening to older family members instead of just assuming we know better." Dorothy smiled, overhearing the conversation and understanding that this was exactly the kind of dialogue the exhibition was meant to inspire. The hidden treasures weren't just valuable objects. They were the stories, wisdom, and perspectives that elderly people carried, often unrecognized and unappreciated by younger generations, who were too quick to dismiss what they didn't immediately understand. As the museum prepared to close, Dorothy took one final walk through the exhibition. The jewelry pieces looked magnificent in their professional displays, but she felt no sadness about having shared them with the world. Their real value had never been in private ownership, but in the lessons they could teach about recognition, respect, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The Zimmermann bracelet on her wrist caught the gallery lighting as she moved, creating tiny flashes of gold that reminded her of the cardinal that still visited her bird feeder every morning. Some treasures were meant to be shared, while others were meant to be kept close, daily reminders of the wisdom and love that connected generations across time. Jessica appeared beside her, notebook in hand as always. "Grandma, I know you're probably tired, but I wanted to ask you one more question for the oral history project. Looking back on everything that's happened, what do you think was the most important discovery?" Dorothy looked around the exhibition hall, taking in the crowds of people who had come to learn about hidden treasures and overlooked value. She thought about the conversations happening throughout the museum, the families who would go home and listen more carefully to their elderly relatives, the older adults who would find courage to assert their own worth. "The jewelry was valuable," Dorothy said slowly, "but the most important discovery was that I had never lost my worth. It was always there, waiting for me to recognize it and insist that others recognize it too. The music box just gave me the confidence to stand up for what I had always deserved." As they left the museum together, Dorothy felt the weight of the Zimmermann bracelet against her wrist and thought about the family dinner planned for the following evening. Susan had offered to host, but Dorothy had insisted on cooking at her own house, in her own kitchen, surrounded by the objects and memories that told her story. The music box would sit on the counter, its restored mechanism ready to play for Elise with perfect clarity. But more importantly, it would serve as a reminder that the most precious things in life are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone wise enough to look beyond surface appearances to discover the treasures beneath. And Dorothy Williams, great-granddaughter of a jewelry maker's daughter, inheritor of wisdom and beauty and strength, would continue to share that lesson with anyone ready to listen and learn that true value cannot be diminished by others' failure to recognize it. The story of the worthless jewelry box had become a story of priceless discovery, not just of valuable objects, but of the courage to choose yourself, to demand respect, and to live according to your own understanding of what makes life meaningful and rich. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.